All right. Hello, this is John Faithful Hamer, the Likeville podcast, and today I'm going to be talking with Fred Serre, who's a cartoonist, journalist, photographer. He's done all sorts of different things. And he's the kind of person that you find living in cities these days, especially in a place like Montreal, people who seem to do everything. So my first question to you is, how did you get into writing cartoons?
My mother was an art teacher, and she had a particular sense of humor. In fact, they had such a great sense of humor that they moved from the south of France to Sydney, Nova Scotia. That's how much of a sense of humor they had. Which, of course, we arrived in September. Isn't it great? Like the typical French people. Oh, c'est super, hein? Oh, on arrive au Canada, c'est gigantesque. And of course, we brought the Renault 16, this flimsy car with like the doors are this wide. And, they're driving this car in Cape Breton with the foliage and the change of colors and everything's great. And then January hits.
Couldn't start it.
Voiture de Marpa, c'est quoi cette pourriture? So that's how we start. So my mother instilled in us, there's 4 of us kids in the family. When we all draw, we're all artists. And so she instilled in us this appreciation of drawing. And what really did it was in high school, in Nova Scotia, I had a buddy by the name of Paul Chapman. And he and I would draw cartoons all the time. And I would always try to follow his lead. He was just a phenomenal cartoonist, just an amazing guy. Fortunately, he got murdered in Ottawa in 1983.
Oh, wow.
And by that time, I was living in Ontario for the summers because I was going to Concordia during the year and then working at home in Cornwall. And I pick up the paper one morning and I see this photo of this guy. I thought, boy, he looks like Paul. And it's a story about how he was murdered.
Wow.
Came home from work in Ottawa, walked in on 2 men raping and beating his girlfriend.
Oh, my.
So she jumped out the window and they grabbed him and they tortured him and killed him. So, yeah, there's a bit of a downer, huh?
Wow.
But I have a framed photo of him in my apartment, and I think of him all the time. He's the one that got me really into cartooning. And I've kept a lot of his cartoons. In fact, a number of years ago, I brought a whole batch and I brought them to his parents. And,
wow.
Yeah.
One thing that has always sort of mystified me about you is that you have this incredible sunny disposition. You're this very happy, optimistic person, and yet, I talk to you, and
there's always a story.
You've experienced all sorts of. You've seen the dark side of human nature. You've been you worked with the police, and how do you see so much darkness and maintain this happy kind of disposition?
I think years working with cops, you realize that they need a dark sense of humor.
Okay. Gallows humor.
Yeah, they have to. And that's why sometimes it can come across as offensive to a lot of people. But I've been in the company of homicide cops who have been on the scene. There was once we went on a call, all right? And the guy had committed suicide. He hung himself. And the farewell note, the reason he killed himself is he couldn't get an erection throughout his life. Oh. And that was his thing. So he wrote a farewell note.
Could have been saved by Viagra.
Well, the problem is he'd been hanging for so long that he was in an erection because the blood had gone.
Oh my God.
And so the cops were all laughing and going, oh yeah, hey, look at you. A little too late. But so that's completely offensive, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's a little bit of that. But I think in my family, we all have a bit of a dark humor side to us.
Yeah. One of the most true things I've ever seen in a movie that mentioned comedy is in Harry Potter, where they do that special spell where you imagine the thing that you're most afraid of and you say a spell, ridiculous, right? And by making fun of it, it actually takes away the fear, right? And very often, I don't know where I learned how to do that. I suspect it's a very natural human thing, but when you're scared of something, you make fun of it, and somehow that takes away the sting. It's not as scary anymore.
I firmly believe in that. And so, for example, when I do my cartoons, I'll do my cartoon. For example, I do one every week at the Gazette, and I tend to forget that some people will get offended. There's always someone that gets offended,
especially in this day and age.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. And but I forget about that. I just do my cartoon because it's almost like a Tourette's mild. It has to come out. It's like a bad pun. It has to come out, like a bad joke or something dark about,
yeah. Well, you deal with some very, very touchy subject matter, and I'm always kind of amazed that you get away with it most of the time. And I'm wondering, do you think there's something about comedy, or there's something about that allows you to talk about difficult things and get away with things that you wouldn't if you were being really serious.
Absolutely. And I think every stand-up comedian will tell you that. I remember I did on Facebook, I did a survey. I think you participated in that. I know David Lieber, my friend, participated, and he hated it. And what all I did was I just started a discussion on my Facebook page. There was a comedian. There's a comedian by the name of David Pride here in Montreal. A number of years ago at the Just for Laughs Festival, he did a joke that got panned by B'nai B'rith and the Jewish community. And the joke went something like this. So I took my family out on a vacation, and we visited Auschwitz. Once we were done with the tour, I went to the souvenir shop, got a postcard, and mailed it to my mother-in-law and wrote, "Wish you were here." Oh, so.
Oh my God,
and then,
that's terrible.
With David at that time, David Pride said, "Well, it's a mother-in-law joke." I just think it's absolutely hysterical, but not everybody did. And in fact, on my Facebook page, people got out, into all-out wars. Mm-hmm. And some people, that I thought would actually get the joke and appreciate it, no, they got terribly offended. So I think everybody gets offended by something.
Yeah.
But I'm always surprised by what that is.
Yeah. Well, you never really know, right? But you seem to be not very afraid. A lot of people are chastened. There's been some people like Ben Stiller has said this. There's a bunch of them that have said you can't really do comedy right now at this moment because people are things are so charged and people are so upset that it's not a good time to do comedy. I mean, do you think that's true?
Well, it's not a good time because I think everybody with social media, Facebook, Twitter, everybody now has an opinion, and they'll unleash their opinions right away. Because back in the days before social media, if you got really upset at a cartoon you saw in the newspaper, you'd sit down, pull out a typewriter, type your letter, put a stamp on the envelope, walk to the... See, by the time you do that, forget it.
It took a while.
Right? Whereas now, right away, immediate offense is taken, and it's very easy.
Yeah.
So, is that a good thing? I don't know.
That's very true. The immediacy changes everything. Like, do you remember the old lottery tickets? Mm-hmm. I don't know if they still have them on there, but if you won... you would have to, you would have to fill out the skill testing question.
Yes.
And I remember somebody who works for Lotto Quebec, and he said, you would not believe how many people don't cash in the ticket just because of the skill testing. Like the little hoop to pass is enough to make a lot of people, not do it, right? It's funny, I watched Chris Rock's new comedy special, Tambourine.
Yes, you quoted from him the other day. I saw that.
Which is on Netflix right now. And he says that one of the things that he thinks destroyed his marriage was cell phones. he says because, when I was growing up, my parents, they would go off to work during the day, and that was it. They wouldn't see each other until the evening. And so they missed each other. And when they saw each other, they had a bunch of, new stuff to talk about, and they would say like, hey, and how was your day? And they would, right? Because now, you're texting and messaging constantly all the time. So when you actually get together, you've been in touch all day long. And in fact, probably one of you is a little peeved because the other person didn't respond immediately to a text or something like that.
Yep.
And you don't have any new stories to tell because you've been in contact constantly, all the time. And he says, I was married for 16 years. And he says, my parents were married for, I don't remember what he says, 40 years, something like that. And he says, but I actually spent way more time, if you total it up, with my wife than my parents spent together ever. I mean, that's the same sort of immediacy that you're talking about. But, I mean, do you think this is ultimately a good thing or a bad thing, or do you think it just is what it is?
I think it's a good thing if you're a good communicator because... you always have something to say. I don't think
it's not always very smart.
But I know a lot of friends, people in my own family who not the best communicators. So yeah, I think it might be a hindrance for people like that. But for those of us who have endless things to say, we'll never run out of things to say ever.
Yeah, I guess always with these new mediums, there's always. Depending on people's personality type, some people are better able to adjust to it, right? So some people can, for instance, Susan Cain in her book Quiet, which is all about introverts, she says how the internet has been fantastic for introverted people because it allows them to communicate in a way that is not, face-to-face and kind of precisely the kinds of ways of communicating that they're normally stressed out about. they can do online in a way that is a wonderful, wonderful thing for them. It's almost as if you're going to somebody that has a severe disability and you're giving them a technology that allows them to communicate with the world, Stephen Hawking style. Yeah. Like she says, it's that intense for people who are really, really introverted, right? But there's definitely, there's some loss to that. But another kind of versatility that amazes me is people like you who seem to have mastered a bunch of different domains, whether it be like photography, videography, writing, making cartoons, doing all these different things. How do you just get into completely new fields? Because we have the standard idea, which I'm supposed to tell my students, but we all know is kind of bullshit, right? Which is that, you go and get a degree in something, and then you get a certificate and a degree, and you go and do that thing. But increasingly, people who are doing a particular thing are doing it just because they went and started doing it. Like, I know a bunch of programmers and system administrators who they didn't go and do a degree in computer science. They did a degree in music, or they did a degree in philosophy, or they didn't do any degree. They just learned how to code by working with other people, and now that's their job, and they're making like lots of money on it. So how do you just reinvent yourself again and again, and how did that start?
Well, I think when you're self-employed, the one thing you never say is no. So if your phone rings, or
can you do that? Sure.
When you want it. Anything that comes my way, I always say yes. So
I'll keep that in mind.
Can you clean my toilet?
Yeah. Can you dress up like a clown? Yeah, you actually did do that once.
I did. Good Lord. Yeah, it was a clown.
The craziest stories.
Reminded of Joe Pesci. What am I, a clown?
So you just say yes to
yes. So for example,
everything.
A while back I was asked, can you just translate these 3 paragraphs from French to English? Oh, okay. It's easy. Then all of a sudden I find myself in the dressing room of the Montreal Canadiens as the translator for the Canadians, or the Boston Bruins. I'm going, what the hell am I doing here? So I did that for a few years as well. So whenever the Boston Bruins would come and play in Montreal during the playoffs, I was hired by the team to be their translator. So for example, after the post-game, during the post-game news conference, the coach is answering questions both in English and French. At that time it was Claude Julien. And so the Boston organization wanted to know what questions the French media were asking. They don't want to miss anything. So I was hired. And it was great. I had like full access to the dressing rooms, and I would hang out with them. How did this happen?
You right? Say yes. Somebody asks you
always
if you
say
can
yes.
do it.
Yeah.
Always say yes.
Yeah.
That's interesting because Eric Weinstein, who is right now major manager for Teal's Money, right over down in California, he, in an interview once, somebody asked him about the imposter complex. And he said, you're trained as a physicist, and yet you're managing billions of dollars. Like, what's going on? How do you do this? And he goes, well, he said something very similar to you. He said, well, you just say yes. If somebody asks you, can you do this? You just sort of shake a little bit and say yes. And then you go and figure out how to do it, right? And very often you're creating the position.
That's exactly
it didn't exist already, right?
That's exactly
Which increasingly is happening. And I don't, as an educator, I don't really know what to do about this, because the official line that I'm told to tell to my students, I know is not true anymore. Like you go and get a degree in a particular thing, and then you think you're going to work in that field. It almost never works out that way, right? And I guess this happened to you with journalism, right?
Yeah, all the time.
So what happened with journalism?
After I graduated, I worked as a technical editor, and I did that for a couple of years. And then I was working for a company called Philips Information Systems, writing computer manuals. And at that time, I was making $30,000.
Really fun.
Oh God! I was making $30,000 a year, and I hated my job. And I get a phone call from a friend of mine. She was the editor of at that time was the Chronicle out in West Town. She says, "How would you like to come to work? I have a spot open as a reporter." So I took a $15,000 cut in pay.
Wow.
And I went to work there, and my father had a fit. He says, "Are you crazy? You had a pension there. You had a great salary." Well, within 5 months, Philips shut their doors. They put 500 people out of work.
Whoa.
So I guess, I ended up spending.
I
spent 8 years at the Chronicle, and among those 8 years, I was a crime reporter. And the reason I became a crime reporter is because one day, one of the sergeant detectives says, "Hey, you smart-ass journalist, you think it's easy to be a cop? I dare you to come with me. We're going to do a ride-along for 2 nights."
Oh, wow.
So I said, okay. So I did it. And I that's when I caught the bug, the whole police angle. And he trusted me for some reason. So I did a lot of patrols with him, and he put me in touch with other cops, and I started investigating gangs, street gangs. Went right in there. Now, see, just to show you how the unfolding of events. The reason I was fired from the Chronicles, I tried to start a union with a bunch of other journalists, and we lost the vote, and one by one, just like in Goodfellas. At the end of the Goodfellas, we all went down.
Yeah,
we all went down. So I got fired, but within 3 months, I got hired by the largest police union in Canada.
Wow.
So you see, it's just ding, 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 all connect the dots, and it was a great move.
So what kind of stuff do you do have you done for the police? Like, are you like a PR guy for them?
Well,
or?
I'm the media relations guy for the RCMP union in Quebec. Not many people know this, but until 2015, it was illegal for RCMP to even consider unionizing.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So I'm part of an association that launched a suit, a motion before the Supreme Court of Canada, and they ruled in our favor that RCMP officers have a right to unionize. We use a charter of rights to get that done. So right now it's legal. So I do the media relations. I put out a magazine. I do press releases. I go on patrols with the cops. We organize an awards gala for police officers every year. So I handle the media there. And yeah.
I have police officers come and speak to my classes with some regularity, especially my good and evil class, the ethics class. And very often what you hear from police officers, and I think this is actually a general pattern in our society, is they'll say, you can't criticize what we do unless you're in law enforcement and you know how difficult this job is, you can't say anything about it, right? And there's a certain amount of logic to that, because definitely, I'm sure as you discovered in the ride along, and I've discovered having long conversations with lots of police officers, they deal with humanity at its worst, right. So I understand how nurses have a very similar situation, right? So I get that feeling, but the problem is increasingly everybody's saying that. So doctors say you're not allowed to critique doctors unless you're a doctor, right? And nurses say that, and I've heard it from people in my profession, profs and teachers saying, you can't criticize teachers unless you're a teacher, right? You can't criticize. And so this sort of feeds into this expert culture where everybody's in their echo chambers and their silos, and we're not allowed to actually say anything about anything, right? So that's why I find people like you, they're generalists that have your finger in like a lot of different pies and are really interesting, because if we're going to have democracy and the open society, we need to have a general understanding, right? Because it would be terrible if we all were in these airtight communities that were sealed from any criticism. But how do you respond to people who say, like in law enforcement, who say you can't criticize us unless you're a cop?
Unfortunately, there are way too many police officers who make it easy to be shat on. I'll give you one example that comes to mind right now. Almost a year ago, there was the floods out in West Island.
Sure. Yep.
And there was a situation where there was a local guy. It was a guy in Roxborough. He'd start building sandbags on one spot, and the cops had said you can't do that. So the media was there. They were all there, cameras, and these young cops arrested the guy.
Oh.
So instead of the guy he was obviously tired. He'd been up for like days, and he's just doing what he can to. Here was a glorious opportunity for the cops to go, hey, you know what? Let's help this guy.
Yeah.
Come on, guys.
Great PR opportunity.
What they did, they arrested him in front of all these citizens. They were all screaming, yelling, "Don't do that!" Like that's a class. I've talked to a lot of retired cops who said, they would have done it differently because they saw the cameras. Let's go in there. Let's help this guy. But no, we had to do it by the book. And the young cops there looked like a bunch of brutes and bullies.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember commenting on Facebook, I can't defend that. I realize they have a job to do and you got to do things by the book. But once upon a time, there are a lot of cops who would have done, they would have had, they would have been given shit by their bosses later, but they would have scored amazing PR points.
Yeah. Well, I find one real difference I've seen in policing in Montreal in my lifetime is that when I was a kid growing up in the Southwest in Verdun, the police officers, for the most part, actually lived in the neighborhood
Yeah.
where they worked or close by, right? And so most of the cops that we knew in the neighborhood, they either lived like in Verdun or they had family. Their mom lived, like there. Their sister lived there, and so they were connected to the community in a real way. And so I think that makes it much more likely that you're going to view the people that you're dealing with on a daily basis as human beings, fellow citizens, where increasingly what I find is the Montreal police force, most of them live out in small, homogeneous towns outside of Montreal, and they come into Montreal like an invading force, and they have contempt for Montreal. They think Montreal is this, very kind of horrible place, right? And so they're coming in, and they don't have that connection to the community, right? Which is, and I mean, this is a widespread problem. You see this also with public schools. You see this with hospitals. Like if the teachers and the educators have their own kids in the school that they're teaching at, or kids from their community, they're going to have a different attitude towards it than if you're coming in from the outside.
If you're a 22-year-old cop living in Saint-Julie on South Shore, but you patrol in Hochelaga Maisonneuve,
yeah,
well, there might be a bit of a problem. How do you respond to a domestic abuse case in Hochelaga Maisonneuve on a Friday night of a full moon when you're still living with mom and dad in Saint-Julie? I'm not saying you can't do the job, but chances are, unless you live in that area. There's a gentleman by the name of Frank Taylor, a constable, who's retired now from Montreal, and he spent 28 years as a cop in Pierrefonds, and he lived in Pierrefonds.
Oh wow!
And he was sometimes by the book, but most times he used his brains and common sense. And I still turn to him now, on Facebook, and I ask him about situations, and I always know that he's going to give me the common sense answer because also he lived where he patrolled.
Yeah. Well, it gives you, you have that connection to the community, and you're less likely to respond to go into fight, flight, or freeze mode, right? You're not. A much more extreme case of this would be in Baltimore when I was in grad school, living in Baltimore.
Yeah.
That was absolutely unbelievable.
So you live The Wire every day?
The Wire is basically a documentary. I mean, it's completely. They don't exaggerate at all. It's actually like that in Baltimore. But the one thing I noticed with Baltimore, which we don't have here, thank God, is that not only are they coming in from the outside as an invading, an occupying army from the outside, no connections to the community. But they also have the problem there that the police are paid horribly. Right? They're really not paid well at all. So the only way you can actually make money often is to be corrupt in some way. I mean, we to give you an example, Annalise and I used to go to this club all the time. It was a fantastic club called 1722 on Charles Street. And there was a guy, he was sort of the house dealer in the club, right? And he dealt, ecstasy, coke, and things like that, like in this club. And everybody called him Cop John, right? And we thought it was a joke. Like, the way you would call like a big guy tiny or something like that. Like, we thought it was a joke, Cop John, until we saw him on the front page of the Baltimore Sun and on the nightly news being taken away in handcuffs. He actually was a police officer. He was a Baltimore City police officer.
Supplementing his income.
He had like a few dozen people working for him. He had and they would literally show up to the club. They would do raids, confiscate all sorts of drugs, and then right away go and sell them out in the open in a club, being known as Cop John. Driving, finishing their shift, showing up in a cop car, in their civvies, but in a cop getting dropped off by a coworker. It was just completely out in the open. And the investigation into it, one of the things that they said is, okay, yes, we have a systemic problem with corruption, but much as Giuliani, when they brought him down, the Mexican government brought him down, Rudy Giuliani, to deal with the problems they had with the Mexican police and widespread corruption. And the first thing Giuliani said was, you need to pay your cops way, way more money. There's no way somebody can live off of what you're paying them. So just in order to put food on their table and take care of their kids, they need to be corrupt in order to just make a living wage, right? So there was a similar problem in Baltimore, not as extreme. But do you think, is corruption a really big problem in the law enforcement in Montreal, Canada today, or do you think
I think there's less and less because there's way too many young cops now who are terrified of making a mistake. And, deontology, they don't want to hear anything about that. I think they're extremely careful. And maybe this is the new batch, new generation of police officers.
So you don't think corruption is pretty much
I don't think it's
largely a thing of the past?
Yeah,
that's my sense too. But then I mention this to people and they say, "Oh, you're being naive." But my sense is that there's doesn't seem to be much happening. I mean, there are some signs, right? I remember there was a a drug delivery service which was passing out flyers, like business cards at Sherbrooke Metro, and at in the middle of middle of the day, handing out flyers for a delivery service. And I remember thinking, there's no way this can exist if they're not paying somebody off. How could you be delivering that in the middle of the day? But when I asked some officers that I know, I said, what's going on? How can somebody be doing this? They said they tried to call the number and the number had been disconnected. So I don't know. I mean, what do you think about something like that?
Oh boy,
what would be your guess? Because you know way more about police stuff than I do. So
well, I think unless they have somebody under surveillance, right, and they're just waiting, and they're just waiting for it to add up.
Oh, it's like some sort of a trap there.
Yeah, there might be a lot of that. I just recall when I used to be a journalist, and I would always have. So if we think information is being controlled today through the hierarchy of Montreal Police, media relations department, it's pretty tight right now. But 25 years ago, it was kind of tight. But as a journalist, I always had, if there's an investigation of a murder, I always know I can turn to 2-3 cops, and he'll give me l'heure juste. Okay. Whereas if you go through an information officer, he'll just give you the standard line. I wonder if that exists today. If there are cops within who aren't scared. I always had a handful that I knew would talk to me anyway, and even if they were caught, they didn't give a shit. Really. Whereas I think everybody today is on pins and needles and afraid to get caught.
Oh, every time I've had police officers come speak to my classroom, they've had to clear it with their superior, and I've had to tell all of my students, give me your cell phones, your laptops. There can be no recording devices. I make it very, very clear, what is said in the classroom remains in the classroom, and we don't. And it's very, because they are afraid of somebody taking a little cell phone video, because in the class, when I have them in the classroom, it's no holds barred. We have, for instance, during the student strike, right, the Maple Spring, I had 2 people who were leaders of the protest come in and give their side of the account and explain everything that they had seen and experienced, the police brutality and stuff like that. And the students listened to their account and then asked them lots of difficult questions, right? Then I had 2 police officers who were on the other side, right? Wow. And they explained what had actually happened, and they brought so they showed me cell phone kind of video footage of things that they had seen, which did not make it into the media at all, and they gave their side of the situation. But both sides were very clear about the fact, okay, if we want to have an honest conversation, we want to know you're not going to record any of this. So So they both took a lot of questions, really difficult questions, and then I had the students write an essay where they had to sort of, based on what they had heard from these sort of witnesses, right, and then also what they had read in the news and what they had seen, they had to decide what they thought of the situation, who they thought was at fault. Right now, I was surprised that maybe it's because they're West Island kids, I don't know, but the vast majority of them sided with the cops.
Wow.
Yeah, vast majority. It was about sort of 2 out of 3 of the essays said that they thought that the cops were. they sympathized with their situation a great deal. I mean, which I thought was fascinating. But yeah, I mean, definitely the only way that could happen is if there were assurances that there would be no. Right?
Every year we have the Quebec Police Awards Gala. We've been doing it since 1999, and it's at the end of November, and there's usually about 35 police officers from across the province who are being honored for acts of bravery, investigations, and so on. And it involves RCMP, Sûreté de Québec, Montreal, Quebec, Laval, any police force in the province. And it's a very positive event. But even then, the Sûreté de Québec and other police departments, they send in their information or media relations person to make sure that the police officers stay in line. So, and it's quite interesting because, I mean, I understand everybody has a job to do, but they also want to make sure the cops don't say anything that could be taken out of context, or if there's an ongoing court case going on. So they're like watching what the police officer is saying to the media.
Wow.
So even in a situation where it is very positive, good PR, you have that. I think it's the new reality nowadays.
Yeah. Well, I think it's just so easy in this day. I mean, perhaps it's always been easy, but it feels like it's more easy now to take something out of context and to misrepresent something and to make somebody sound really terrible by just like taking, for instance, 10 seconds of an hour-long interview, for instance, and making them sound. And so if you have an axe to grind and you really want to make the police look terrible, or you want to make that it seems like it's easier to do it now than it has been in the past. But what is the most sort of heroic thing that you've ever personally sort of heard of or seen, like in your years of working with law enforcement?
Well, it's really interesting. In 2000, I applied to join the RCMP, so I'd gone through the various phases. Yeah, in 2000. So, and one of the things I had to take was a first responders course, so I passed that. Well, it's really interesting because if you've ever taken a first aid,
I haven't. Yeah.
The things that stay with you in moments of emergencies, and I've had 3 occasions to do exactly that. And I just happen to sometimes find myself in a position.
Everybody says you're like Forrest Gump. You're always
crazy.
there. You're always there at the most random moments. It's kind of eerie.
There was one time I was driving to go play hockey in Saint Lazare, and I was driving from the plateau to Saint Lazare. It was February. It was a very cold night, and I'm on my way along Lachine on Highway 20. Up ahead, I see traffic is moving in the right lane, and there's a car on fire, and there's a guy trying to pull someone out of the car. So I parked right in front, and I went in. And I said, "Do you need help?" He says, yeah. So we try to pull this guy out of this. So his front end of the car was bashed in, and the flames were licking away at the engine at the front. And he was stuck. His legs were stuck in below the steering wheel, and he was on the passenger side. And his hip was broken, you could tell. So we're trying to pull him out, and the flames are just growing and growing. So we yanked him out.
Whoa.
And it wasn't, time disappears, but maybe 10, 15 seconds later, the car went poof.
Oh my God.
And
even like an action movie.
Even as it was happening, I was wondering, where's the big boom? The earth-shattering kaboom. There's no kaboom. It was just like this whoo, and this blast of heat. And so things that came back to me from my first aid training, one is to keep the guy conscious, just keep talking to him, make sure he can breathe properly. And it was surreal. It was absolutely surreal. And then as he came to, he says, what about my friends? I said, what, there's somebody else? I'm like, yeah, my friends are in the car. And at this point, there was no fire trucks. There was no ambulance. It was just me and this other guy. And finally, the fireman dropped by, and I said, he says there's somebody in the car. Oh, okay, no problem. Come on. No, there was nobody else.
Oh, really? He was just out of his mind at that point? Delirious?
And what had happened to him, as I ended up talking to witnesses, is that he was speeding on Highway 20, darting in and around cars, and he hit the back of, those buses that take people to the airport?
Yeah.
The 747 bus.
Mm-hmm.
And then spun out of control and...
Wow.
So then I got to the hockey arena full of blood and dirt, and Norm Morris said, one of my hockey players, says, okay, what happened to you now? And then there was another time I did the Heimlich maneuver on a guy at a restaurant patio on Saint Denis Street. And again, the first aid training just kicks in. And so I could just hear a weird noise, and I turn around and I see this poor guy grabbing his throat, and he fell. And when he fell, he hit his head on the concrete, and he started bleeding and shaking. And everybody was screaming, so I just dove right in and did the Heimlich.
That's amazing. Well, one of the things that's very shocking in situations like that is that most people freeze and do nothing. And where I teach at John Abbott College, one of our programs is we have like an EMT program, right?
Wow.
For people who are going to work in ambulances and stuff like that. And I've had lots of really interesting conversations with these students, and they say, you get all of this training in what to do in a situation, and you practice it again and again and again, and you do tests on it, and you know it kind of intellectually, and you know it, all this stuff. But they said very often the first time, when you're doing your stage and stuff like that, the first time you actually are on a bloody, very intense scene, people, they puke, they pass out, they freeze and just can't act, right?
Yeah.
They and so you get past that, right? I mean, they say everybody gets past it, but at first, and so I'm always amazed when I encounter people who just seem to have this heroism where they. My Uncle Peter is like this. I mean, he's the kind of person, like a plane crashed in his neighborhood and was engulfed in flames, and everybody's standing around looking at it, and he's the one who just like pushes past the crowd and goes and saves the people, right? So I'm always amazed by, like, what do you think it is about? Is it just training people who behave in a heroic way when everybody else just like stands by? And
instinct, it's personality, it's just instinct. Like I've been told by some people, you're being stupid. You're putting yourself in danger for nothing. And I just do it. I mean, I jumped on. I went to the SAQ a couple of months ago, and there was this woman that tried to run out with bottles of champagne.
Really?
Yeah. She punched the guy that was blocking her way, pushed him out of the way. He fell. I jumped on her, and I was riding her. and this is here on St. Catherine, in the village, right next to the park. And she was strong, and I was riding her. It looked like ridiculous.
That is.
And then the manager came out. She punched him. He fell, and I'm riding her. And the security guard is across the other side. So finally he shows up. He says, "Just let her go, let her go, let her go." I said, "Are you sure?" And I felt her jacket ripping.
Wow.
But there were people standing around filming.
Just like that, not doing anything.
So I let her go. But I thought she really needed a drink, huh?
Yeah, I worked when I was a teenager. You remember Steinberg's? Like
Yes.
They're out of business now, the big grocery store chain in Quebec. I worked for the Steinbergs in Alexis Neon Plaza, and I was a bagger, then I was a cashier, and then for quite a while I was a checker. I would walk around like in plain clothes and kind of see people.
You're a floor walker.
Yeah, like just seeing people like shoplifting. And I remember being so confused by the fact that like these sketchy looking people, primarily guys, these sketchy looking dudes would like come in and they would go to the meat section and they would like steal lots of like filet mignon and lots of steaks and things like that. And I had no idea why. And so I asked my manager once, I'm like, what is these people want meat so badly? he said, well, they're drug addicts and there are dealers that will accept like steak for
really?
drugs. It's a commodity on the street. It's you could like trade steaks. So, but I was just sometimes I'd stop these guys and they would have their all their trench coat just lined with steaks. Yeah. Like what? Like, what are you, a zombie? Like, what is this? It's you're a bloodthirsty monster. But
I put myself through university by being a floor walker at Kmart.
Really?
In Cornwall, Ontario. I did that between 1981 and 85. And I caught two guys with a canoe on top of their heads walking right out of Kmart. Chasing people down the street, running after them. And as you're running, what am I doing? Yeah.
That's, wow, you can't make that up.
I had people waiting for me after my shift, to talk.
The funniest is I see at the dollar stores, the dollar stores, they have floor walkers, and these people are, risking serious charges for a bunch of stuff that's like 99 cents a pop, like they'll for $8 worth of stuff, and they're trying to. And I remember the first time I saw it, I said to the manager of the store, the one on Saint Laurent, I said, is this actually a problem? And he said, you would not believe how much stealing there is at a dollar store. It's like, he said, I've worked at a number of different stores, stuff that was like much more expensive, high end, and I've never seen as much theft as I do at the dollar store. It's but yeah, I mean, this sort of goes back to the question I was asking you before. I wonder, what is the key? Because I mean, a lot of people that know you have remarked on this, that you have this kind of youthful exuberance and energy. You seem very happy, and kind of your lust for life is. What is your secret, or are you even aware of it?
I don't know. I just have fun. Anytime something happens that I'm involved, and I go, like for example, when I was writing that woman in the SAQ, I was thinking this is going to be a great story for my Facebook page. I just see it that way. I just see it as I mean, it's kind of silly. Some people might say, just grow up.
Yeah.
But I just always love being able to tell a story. There's a gentleman that you and I know quite well, Christian Gravener, who's just an amazing storyteller. Yeah. And I love what he does, because he does a little bit what I do, but I think he has such a good variety of stories, and he's always dealing with people hard on their luck, bars and, but outstanding stories, just amazing stories.
I don't know where he finds some of those people. He'll go and find like some bank robber from the 1960s that has recently got out, and he'll find out where they live, and he'll have like a 3-hour long conversation with them, and it's this crazy story. Like, it's
back in the late 80s and early 90s when I worked at the Chronicle, I covered this street gang. And
which one?
The Rebels.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
The West Island Rebels.
West Island Rebels.
You covered them?
Oh, I did.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I got to know some of the gang leaders quite well, including this one guy, Jeff Colgrove. He also went by the name of Carvery. He's now in jail. He's actually finally been caught after being on the run for like 20 years. Wow. He's wanted by the FBI. But I knew all the cops that were after them. Anyway, we're working on a project now that it's still in the formative state, but we are reuniting some of the gang members and the cops. A lot of these gang members have remade their lives, and they're some of them are doing time. But we recently had coffee. One of these gang members was a senior gang member. Now he's completely rebuilt his life. He's got like 8 kids, and we all sat down and had a coffee. It was fascinating, And it was, as they all talked about it, they said it was like a cat and mouse game. Everybody had their job. You're the cop. You're supposed to catch me, and I'm the bad guy. I'm supposed to be on the run.
But there was a sort of a respect, like a Looney Tunes respect for the other side.
Absolutely.
And not. Well, what do you think happened with Montreal when it comes to crime? Because we used to have the West End gang. Montreal for a while was the bank robbery capital of North America, right? There's a lot of crime here, and then suddenly it was all gone, almost all gone, and now we have one of the lowest murder rates in the industrialized West. We have, what do you think happened?
I don't know. Have people discovered Jesus? I don't know. Have they seen the light?
Yeah, I remember being a kid in Verdun, and there were people who had connections to various gangs, and going into becoming kind of a career criminal. That was one of the options, sort of career options. Like if you had a particular skill set or certain connections, it's like, oh yeah, well I could do that as well, right? And it was on the table as a viable option, and it seems to me that it's not anymore, and that's interesting. When I talk to people who are growing up now in those kinds of neighborhoods, they say it's not as much, right? Some people say that it's because the everything's been sort of consolidated now by the Hells Angels, and there's not like random street gangs
you
competing for territory and things like that.
You heard recently how the Montreal police were sort of behind the scenes being thankful to the Hells Angels for helping sort of clean up the whole fentanyl situation.
No.
Because the Hells Angels were sending some of their thugs to go beat up some of these drug dealers who are putting fentanyl in there. And all of a sudden there's been a drop in the number of cases of fentanyl deaths. And
that is fascinating.
Yeah, this happened this summer.
They're policing themselves.
Yeah.
Well, that's always the sense that I got about a lot of these sort of things like prostitution when illegal, and gambling and drugs, that the law enforcement, they sort of understand that there's a big market for this and that it's going to happen, and so they just try and sort of come to some sort of agreement whereby, okay, it's only going to happen in this area, let's say red light district or something like that. And in general, this is what I've heard from once again, when I have these older police officers who are in my class talking to students when there's no recording devices, what they say is, look, we know there's going to be like a drug trade out there because there's a huge demand. So, and most of us are against the war on drugs. We think it's ridiculous, but as long as it's the law, we we have to enforce it. But who would we rather have it run by? Sort of balding middle-aged men with lawns who live in the suburbs, or testosterone pumped like teenage guys who are trigger happy and always looking to prove themselves and filled with attitude? He said, obviously we want it to be run by pragmatic middle-aged men. It's much, and so they made the same point you just said, that it's cleaner, that the Hells Angels, for instance, like they run it like a large corporation, and they try to keep out of the news and not have a lot of drama. But I did not hear about that fentanyl situation. That's amazing. So they've actually been realizing that this is a threat to the bottom line, and it's and so they've sent, and it's been going down.
Yes. That's
fantastic. That is absolutely fantastic. It is. I mean, do you know any of the people involved at all, or are you just like old contacts? Or
really old contacts. But I thought that was such a good story.
Yeah. No. Well, apparently that's I was mentioning that story about Cop John and that club in Baltimore, but apparently one of the reasons why these places would have house dealers was not so much because of corruption and kickbacks and things like that. It was usually because they're like, okay, we know there's going to be drug use on our premises, and that's more or less impossible to stop. So we would at least like to know that the person there is not going to be giving people garbage, so that they're going to be going out on stretchers and ambulances, which looks terrible for the club, which causes the cops to raid us, which causes the city to shut us down, which is bad for business. So apparently they said, it's not as if we're in on this. We're just sort of turning a blind eye to this person doing it because we want to make sure that things are on the up and up. So that kind of goes to exactly the same issue you're talking about. But right. So where do you think you're going to be in 10 years? Because so many of the industries that you're interested in, so many things, things are changing very rapidly. Photography is changing as a profession. Journalism is changing as a profession. What do you think you're going to be doing in 10 years? Because you keep reinventing yourself.
I have to, right? One thing's for sure, there'll be no retirement. There is no such thing for freelancers. There's no such thing as a retirement. You work until you're done.
Yeah.
I guess I do so many things that I kind of hope that hopefully I'll still be doing some of these things.
Yeah. I'm sort of confused about the retirement thing, because on the one hand, I think, retirement age of 65 was instituted by Bismarck in Germany at a time when not a lot of people lived to be past 65. So it was kind of like, here, if you make it to 65, we got you covered for the rest of the time. And now, with people living longer and longer, it seems like, can we really afford as a society to give everybody like 20-year vacation at the end, right? Like 20 years of golf or something like that. However, then again, with automation and increasingly a lot of jobs are disappearing. Right? They can be done by a machine, right? By a computer. And so we're going to have more and more people that are going to be out of work, and it's not going to be a question of, right? There's going to be a lot of people that we just don't need their labor, even if they are very qualified. So then I don't know, right? I don't know what we actually do in that situation. I mean, we could have a guaranteed income supplement, which a lot of people say we have to do. And if we did have something like that, it would make it much more possible to have more people like you in the world, freelancers that, because if you could count on a base income, right? I mean, do you think that would this is something Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates and a number of people have been talking about in the last few years. They say if we had a guaranteed income, it would actually increase the amount of creativity and new ideas, because people wouldn't have to worry about, okay, how am I going to pay my rent and eat? They'd have a basic amount, and then you could try new things.
And there's less stress, less health problems related to stress. And like you say, it would boost creativity. I think that's what be the best thing. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. It was wonderful talking with you, and
appreciate it.
I'll talk to you again soon.
All right. Thank you.